They laughed when he asked to marry the one woman no one in town would even stand beside, and by sunset, not a single one of them could meet her eyes. Before we go on, tell me something. Where are you watching this from tonight? A small town? A big city? Somewhere quiet where the wind still carries stories? And if you believe a person's worth isn't measured by what others see, stay with this one, because this story doesn't end the way you think. The dust hung low over Red Creek that afternoon, drifting slow across the wooden storefronts like it had nowhere better to be. And right in the middle of it, Ethan Cole stepped forward with that same quiet way about him. Boots steady, hat low, eyes fixed not on the crowd, but on her. Maggie Hale stood near the edge of the boardwalk, hands folded tight against her worn dress, shoulders pulled inward like she was trying to disappear into herself the way she had learned to do over the years. Because in Red Creek, disappearing was easier than enduring the looks, the whispers, the small cruel smiles that followed her wherever she went. She was a big woman, broader than most, slower in step, and to them, that was enough to decide everything about her before she ever spoke a word. The men leaning against the saloon rail had already started grinning before Ethan even opened his mouth, like they sensed something worth mocking coming their way. Ethan didn't rush. He never did. He stopped a few feet in front of Maggie, close enough to see the way her fingers trembled just slightly, close enough to notice something no one else ever cared to see. The way her eyes carried more patience than bitterness. Then he said it, plain and steady. "Maggie, marry me." For a heartbeat, the town held still. Then the laughter came, loud and sharp, bouncing off the wooden walls, spilling out into the street like it had been waiting for an excuse. Someone slapped the bar. Another whistled low. A voice called out from behind. Boy must have lost a bet. Even the shopkeeper by the window shook his head, smiling like this was the best show he'd seen all week. Maggie didn't move. Not at first. Her head stayed down, the same way it always did when the world turned its weight on her. But Ethan didn't look at them. Not once. He stood there like the noise didn't belong to him, like he was somewhere else entirely, waiting. The wind picked up just enough to stir the hem of Maggie's dress, brushing dust against her boots, and slowly, almost carefully, she lifted her head. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. Just a small movement. But it was the first time anyone in that town had ever seen her meet their gaze without shrinking. And something in that moment shifted, quiet as a door closing. The laughter didn't stop right away, but it changed. Softer. Uneven. Like even they weren't sure why they were still doing it. Ethan's hand remained at his side, open, not reaching, not forcing, just there, waiting for her choice. And Maggie, for the first time in years, wasn't looking for a place to hide. She was looking at them. The laughter did not end all at once. It thinned out, broke apart, turned into scattered chuckles that no longer felt certain. And Maggie Hale stood there in the middle of it, feeling something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not fear, not shame, something steadier, something that had been buried under years of silence. The men who had laughed the loudest now shifted their weight, boots scraping lightly against the dry wood, eyes flicking anywhere but at her face, because there was something different in the way she looked at them now, something that did not ask for permission to exist. Ethan Cole did not move closer, did not speak again. He simply remained where he was, as if he understood that whatever came next did not belong to him. The wind carried the faint smell of leather and dust across the street, rattling a loose sign above the general store, and in that small, restless sound, Maggie took a breath that seemed to come from deeper than any breath she had taken before. For years, she had listened to their voices define her, reduce her to something easier to laugh at than to understand, and she had believed it, quietly, without argument, because arguing would have meant standing alone. But she realized now, standing there under the open sky with every eye still half turned toward her, that she had always been alone anyway. A man near the saloon coughed, forcing out a weak laugh as if trying to bring the moment back under control, but it did not catch. It fell flat, and even he seemed to hear it. Maggie's hands loosened at her sides, the tight grip she had held for years slipping away without effort. And when she spoke again, her voice was not loud, but it carried, clear and even, like it had been waiting for this exact moment to find its way out. She did not rush her words. She did not look at Ethan. She looked at them. All of them. "You all decided what I was worth before I ever said a word," she said, her tone steady, without accusation, without pleading, and that was what made it land heavier than any raised voice ever could. A woman by the bakery lowered her gaze. The shopkeeper folded his arms, no longer smiling. Someone in the back removed his hat without realizing he had done it. Maggie continued, slower now, each word placed with care. You made me small so you would not have to question yourselves. The silence deepened, stretching across the street until even the usual creak of the buildings seemed to pause. Ethan watched her, not with pride, not with surprise, but with a quiet recognition, like he had seen this version of her long before she allowed anyone else to. Maggie felt the weight of their attention shift, no longer pressing down on her, but pulling back, uncertain, and for the first time, she understood that their power over her had never been as solid as it felt. It had been made of habit, of repetition, of unchallenged assumptions. And now it was cracking. She turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge Ethan's presence beside her without fully facing him. And there was a brief pause, a space where something unspoken passed between them, not a promise, not a rescue, something simpler, an understanding that whatever came next would be chosen, not given. Then she looked back at the crowd, and in the stillness that followed, Red Creek was no longer laughing. The silence did not break right away. It settled deeper, heavier, like dust after a long storm. And in that stillness Maggie Hale could hear something she had never noticed before. The absence of laughter, the absence of judgment spoken out loud, the absence of everything that had once followed her like a shadow. A chair creaked somewhere. Behind the saloon doors, a quiet, uncertain sound, and the man who had made the loudest joke earlier now stared down at his boots, as if they might offer him an answer he could not find in words. Maggie did not rush to fill the silence. She let it sit, let it stretch across every inch of Red Creek, because for the first time, it was not pressing against her, it was pressing against them. Ethan Cole shifted slightly beside her, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just enough to ease the tension in his stance, and the small movement reminded everyone watching that he was still there, still choosing to stand exactly where he had been since the beginning. The sheriff cleared his throat, a dry sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and for a moment it looked like he might speak, might try to pull the town back into something familiar, something easier, but the words never came, and instead he reached up and adjusted his hat, buying himself time he did not know how to use. Maggie's gaze moved slowly across the faces in front of her, not searching for approval, not seeking apology, simply seeing them as they were, people who had never expected to be seen back. A woman near the edge of the crowd pressed her lips together, her expression uncertain, as if she was trying to remember when she had first decided Maggie was someone to look past instead of someone to look at. A young boy, no older than 10, stared openly, confusion written across his face, because this was not the version of the world he had been taught to understand. Maggie felt the weight of all those small realizations gathering in the air, quiet, invisible, but real. She took another breath, slower this time, steady, and spoke again, her voice softer but somehow carrying even further. I am still the same person I was this morning. The words settled gently, without force, without accusation, and that was what made them impossible to argue with. No one moved to contradict her. No one laughed. Ethan finally turned his head just enough to look at her, not fully, not in a way that would take attention away from her moment, but enough that she could feel it, that quiet acknowledgement, and it anchored something inside her that had never had a place to rest before. The sun had begun to dip lower, casting long shadows across the street, stretching figures into shapes that no longer looked quite as solid as they had an hour ago, and Maggie realized that nothing around her had truly changed. The buildings were the same, the people were the same, the dust still clung to the air, but something had shifted in the way it all held together. The town no longer felt like something she had to endure. It felt like something that could be questioned. And as she stood there, no longer shrinking, no longer folding into herself, Red Creek was learning, slowly and unwillingly, that the woman they had overlooked all these years was the one person among them who no longer needed their permission to belong. No one spoke, but the town had not returned to what it was before. Something had shifted beneath the surface, subtle but undeniable, like the ground after a long drought finally feeling the first drop of rain. Maggie Hale could sense it in the way people stood now, not as firm, not as certain, their confidence no longer resting on easy judgment but wavering under the weight of what they had just heard. A door creaked open behind her, slow and hesitant, and old Mr. Carter stepped out from the general store, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the scene, not with amusement, not with approval, but with something closer to thought, the kind that takes time and does not rush to conclusions. Maggie noticed it, the difference, small as it was, and it settled somewhere deep inside her, not as victory, but as acknowledgement. Ethan Cole finally moved, just a single step forward, enough to close the space between them without crowding her, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, meant for her and no one else. You do not owe anyone here an answer. The words landed gently, without pressure, without expectation, and for a moment Maggie simply looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time not as the man who had asked something impossible, but as the man who had waited for her to decide whether it was impossible at all. Around them, the town shifted again, people stepping back, creating space not out of kindness, but out of uncertainty. Unsure of what came next, unsure of where they now stood in a story that no longer belonged to them. The sheriff lowered his gaze, the men at the saloon no longer leaning forward, no longer eager for a show, and the woman by the bakery quietly turned back toward her door, her movements slower than before, thoughtful. Maggie let the silence stretch one more moment, feeling its weight, its absence of ridicule, its strange, unfamiliar calm, and then she did something no one in Red Creek had ever seen her do. She smiled, not wide, not for them, not to soften anything, but small and certain, like someone who had finally reached a place she had been walking toward for years without knowing it. She turned her body slightly, angling away from the crowd, not in retreat, but in choice, and her eyes met Ethan's fully now, steady, clear, unafraid. You asked me a question, she said, her voice even, carrying just enough for him to hear, and maybe a few others who were still close enough to listen without meaning to. But you did not tell me why. The words hung there, simple, direct, and for the first time since he had stepped into the dust, Ethan Cole did not answer right away. He held her gaze, something thoughtful passing behind his eyes, not hesitation, but care, as if he understood that whatever he said next would not be about convincing her, not about proving anything to the town, but about telling the truth in a way that could stand on its own. The wind picked up again, brushing past them, carrying away the last traces of laughter that had once filled the street, and as the sun dipped lower, casting everything in a softer light, the question remained between them, quiet but powerful, not asked in desperation, not offered in weakness, but placed exactly where it belonged, in the space where choice begins. And for the first time, everyone watching realized that this was never about whether he would take her hand, it was about whether she would choose to give it. The question lingered between them, quiet but steady, and Ethan Cole did not rush to fill it. He let the moment breathe, let the weight of it settle into the dust beneath their boots, because he knew this was not something to be answered with quick words or easy promises. He glanced briefly past Maggie, not at the crowd, but through them, as if measuring something far beyond their judgment, then brought his eyes back to hers, calm, unwavering. Because you see things the way they are, he said finally, his voice low, even, carrying only as far as it needed to. And you do not pretend otherwise. There was no grand speech in it, no attempt to impress, just a truth laid down plain, the kind that does not ask for approval. Maggie studied him, her expression unchanged, but something behind her eyes shifted, something that had been guarded for a long time now turning slightly, as if considering whether it was safe to open. Around them, the town held its distance, no one stepping forward, no one interrupting, as though they understood, without saying it out loud, that whatever passed between these two now was no longer theirs to shape. The late afternoon light softened the edges of everything, casting long shadows that stretched across the street, blurring the lines between where one person stood and another ended. And in that fading glow, Maggie felt the last pieces of the old weight loosen from her shoulders. Seeing clearly does not make life easier, she replied after a moment, her voice steady, not defensive, not doubtful, simply honest. Ethan gave the smallest nod, acknowledging the truth in that without trying to soften it. No, he said, but it makes it real. The words hung there, simple and unadorned, and Maggie felt them settle into something deeper than she expected. For years, she had been told, without words, that she needed to change, to shrink, to fit into a shape that made others comfortable. And now here stood a man who was not asking her to change at all, not asking her to become something easier to accept, but choosing her exactly as she was. It was not a rescue. It was not a bargain. It was something else entirely. She looked past him for a brief second, her gaze brushing over the familiar buildings, the faces that had once defined her place in this town. And for the first time, they looked smaller, not because they had changed, but because she had stepped beyond the space they had kept her in. A quiet breath left her lips, slow and measured, and when she looked back at Ethan, there was no hesitation left in her posture, no trace of the woman who had once tried to disappear at the edge of every room. "If I say no," she said, her tone even, testing not him, but the truth of the moment itself, "you will walk away?" Ethan did not hesitate this time. Yes. No conditions. No persuasion. Just the answer. The simplicity of it landed heavier than anything else he had said. Maggie held his gaze for a long second, feeling the steadiness in it, the absence of pressure, the space he was giving her to choose without fear, and in that space, something inside her settled into place. The town watched, silent now, not out of shock, but out of something closer to respect, though none of them would have used that word. Maggie lifted her hand slowly, not reaching yet, just holding it between them, as if weighing the moment, and the air seemed to still around that small movement. What she would do next did not belong to expectation, did not belong to the past, it belonged only to her. And for the first time in her life, that was enough. Her hand remained suspended between them, steady now, no longer trembling, and Ethan Cole did not reach for it. He did not move at all, because this moment was not his to take, it was hers to give. The town seemed to lean into that stillness without realizing it, every breath quieter, every movement slower, as if Red Creek itself understood that something small was about to decide something much larger. Maggie Hale looked at her own hand for a brief second, as if seeing it differently, not as something to hide, not as something to tuck away, but as something that carried weight, choice, and for the first time, authority over her own life. The late sun caught the edge of her fingers, casting a soft glow against the dust, and in that light, she remembered all the years she had pulled those same hands back, folded them into herself, kept them still so no one would notice her more than they already did. But now there was nothing pulling them back. No laughter, no whispers, only silence that waited. She lifted her eyes to Ethan again, searching not for permission, but for truth, and found it there, unchanged, unforced. Patient in a way that did not ask anything from her except honesty. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand into his. Not quickly, not out of pressure, but with a calm certainty that settled the moment the contact was made. Ethan closed his hand around hers, not tight, not claiming, just enough to hold, and the simplicity of it carried more meaning than anything spoken that afternoon. A faint sound moved through the crowd, not laughter, not mockery, something closer to breath being released all at once, like a tension no one realized they were holding had finally let go. Maggie did not look back at them. She did not need to. The decision was no longer theirs to witness, it was hers to live. Ethan gave the smallest nod, acknowledging her choice without turning it into something larger than it was, and for a moment, they simply stood there, two figures in the middle of a town that no longer knew how to define them. The sheriff shifted again, this time stepping back instead of forward, clearing space without announcing it, and one by one, others followed, not in a coordinated movement, but in quiet recognition that something had changed in a way they could not undo. The boardwalk creaked as people moved away, the usual sounds returning slowly, cautiously, but they felt different now, less certain, less entitled. Maggie felt the air around her open, wider than it had ever been, and for the first time, the town did not feel like a place that watched her. It felt like a place she could walk through without shrinking. Ethan released a small breath, almost unnoticed, and tilted his head slightly toward the road that led out past the last building, not as a command, not as a direction, but as a possibility. Maggie followed his glance for a brief second, then looked back at him, and there was a quiet understanding there, something unspoken that did not need explanation. They did not rush. They did not make a show of leaving. But as they began to move, side by side, their steps unhurried, the dust rose gently beneath their boots, and behind them, Red Creek stood still, not laughing, not calling out, just watching, as if trying to understand how something so simple had undone something so certain, and realizing, perhaps too late, that the woman they had once overlooked was the one who had just walked past them without asking permission. They did not get far before the town began to move again, not loudly, not all at once, but in small, uncertain shifts, like people trying to remember how to stand after the ground beneath them had changed. Boots scraped against wood, a door closed softer than usual, voices returned in low murmurs that carried none of the sharpness from before. Maggie Hale felt it behind her, that slow return of sound, but it no longer reached her the same way. It no longer settled on her shoulders or pressed into her back. She walked beside Ethan Cole with a steadiness that surprised even herself, her steps even, her breathing calm, her hands still resting in his without tension, without hesitation. The road ahead stretched out past the last building, a narrow path of packed dirt leading toward open land where fences thinned and the horizon widened, and for the first time, it did not feel like leaving. It felt like choosing. Ethan did not speak right away. He let the rhythm of their steps set the pace. Boots pressing softly into the dust, the sound quiet but certain, and after a few yards, he glanced at her, not to check, not to question, just to acknowledge that she was still there, still walking beside him by her own decision. Maggie noticed it, that glance, and there was something in it that did not demand anything from her, something that allowed her to exist without being measured, and she realized how rare that had been in her life. Behind them, a voice called out, hesitant, unsure, and both of them slowed, not stopping completely, but enough to hear. It was Mr. Carter from the general store, standing near the edge of the boardwalk, hat in his hands, turning it slowly as if the motion might help him find the right words. "Miss Hale," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach them, lacking the certainty it once had. "If you ever need anything." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Maggie turned her head slightly, just enough to see him, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no apology in his face, not fully formed, but there was something else, something closer to recognition, the beginning of it. And Maggie gave the smallest nod, not accepting, not rejecting, simply acknowledging that the moment existed. Then she turned forward again. Ethan noticed the exchange but did not comment on it, and that, too, mattered more than words. They continued walking, the town slowly falling behind them, the sounds fading into something distant and unimportant. The sun dipped lower now, stretching long lines of gold across the land, and the air cooled just enough to carry a different kind of stillness, one that did not feel heavy, but open. Maggie drew a breath, deeper than before, filling her lungs fully, and let it out slowly, as if she was testing the space around her, making sure it would hold. "It feels different," she said quietly, not to him exactly, but into the space between them. Ethan nodded once. "It is." No explanation followed. None was needed. The land ahead did not promise anything easy, did not offer comfort or certainty, but it did not close in on her either, and that was enough. As they walked, side by side, leaving behind the place that had once defined her, Maggie realized something she had never allowed herself to believe before, that the life she stepped into next would not be decided by who had laughed, or who had watched, or who had stayed silent, but by the simple, steady choices she made from this moment forward. And for the first time, the unknown did not feel like something to fear. It felt like something she was finally ready to meet. The road stretched farther than it had seemed from the edge of town, each step carrying them deeper into a quiet that did not judge, did not whisper, did not follow, and Maggie Hale began to notice the small things she had never allowed herself to feel before. The steady rhythm of her boots against the earth, the soft creak of leather, the way the evening air brushed against her skin without weight or expectation. Ethan Cole walked beside her at the same unhurried pace, neither leading nor trailing, his presence constant but never pressing, like a shadow that chose to stay instead of something that simply followed. The town behind them had nearly disappeared now, reduced to a faint outline against the fading light, and with it went the last echoes of the life she had known, the one shaped By other people's voices, other people's decisions, other people's narrow definitions of who she was allowed to be. Ahead, the land opened wide, fences spaced farther apart, fields stretching into long bands of gold and brown, and the sky seemed larger out here, as if it had more room to hold whatever came next. Maggie drew in another breath, deeper than before, and this time it did not feel like she was testing the air. It felt like she was claiming it. "Where does this road go?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying easily in the open space. Ethan glanced ahead, then back at her, the hint of something thoughtful in his expression. "Far enough," he said, simple, not evasive, just enough to leave the rest unspoken. Maggie let that answer settle, not needing more, because for the first time, she realized that knowing every detail of what came next was not as important as choosing to take the step. The sun hovered just above the horizon now, casting a warm, fading glow that softened everything it touched, and in that light, Maggie noticed something she had never paid attention to before, her own shadow, long and steady on the ground beside his, not smaller, not hidden, but equal in its place, moving forward with each step she chose to take. They walked in silence for a while, not the heavy silence of before, not the kind that demanded to be filled, but something easier, something that allowed thought to settle without interruption. Maggie's mind drifted back for a brief moment, not to the laughter, not to the years of being overlooked, but to the moment she had lifted her head, the moment she had spoken, the moment everything had shifted, and she realized that it had not been the town that changed. It had been her decision to stop accepting what they believed. That understanding settled deeper than anything else had that day. Ethan adjusted his hat slightly against the lowering sun, then slowed just a fraction, enough that she would notice if she chose to. And after a few steps, he spoke again, his tone as even as before. "There is a place about 3 miles out, small house, needs work, but it stands." He did not say more. He did not dress it up. Maggie considered that, the idea of a place that was not defined by anyone else's expectations, a place that simply existed, waiting to be shaped by the people who chose to live within it. She looked ahead, imagining it not as it was, but as it could become, and for the first time, the thought did not feel distant or impossible. It felt within reach. The wind shifted gently, carrying the scent of dry grass and open land, and Maggie felt something settle inside her that had never quite found its place before, not hope exactly, but something steadier, something that did not rise and fall with other people's opinions. As they continued walking, side by side, the last light of day stretching across the land, Maggie understood that the road ahead would not be easy. It would not be free of hardship or challenge, but it would be hers, shaped by her choices, her voice, her willingness to stand where she had once stepped back, and that, more than anything else, was what made each step forward feel real. The house came into view just as the last edge of sunlight slipped behind the horizon, small and still against the open land, its wooden frame worn but standing, like it had been waiting without expectation for someone to arrive. Maggie Hale slowed her steps without realizing it, her eyes tracing the outline of the place, the slanted roof, the narrow porch, the single window catching what little light remained, and something about it felt unfamiliar in a way that was not unsettling, but new. Ethan Cole stopped a few feet short of the gate, giving her space again, always that same quiet distance that allowed her to decide how close to come. "It is not much," he said, his voice even, without apology, without promise, just truth. Maggie stepped forward slowly, her boots pressing into the soft dirt, and as she moved closer, she could see the small details that spoke of time rather than neglect, the door worn smooth by years of use, the fence leaning slightly but still holding, the land around it open enough to breathe. She placed her hand lightly on the gate, feeling the rough wood beneath her fingers, and paused there, not entering yet, not turning back, simply standing at the edge of something she had never been given before, a place that did not already have a story written for her. Behind her, Ethan remained. Still, not watching the house, not watching the land, but watching her, not with expectation, not with hope that she would accept, but with a steady patience that did not change regardless of what she chose. The air had cooled now, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and evening settling in, and Maggie took a slow breath, letting it fill her fully, not holding it back, not making it smaller. She pushed the gate open. The hinge creaked softly, a simple sound that seemed louder in the quiet. And as she stepped inside, something shifted again, not in the world around her, but in the way she stood within it. She moved toward the porch, her hand brushing lightly against the wooden rail, and when she reached the door, she rested her palm against it for a moment before opening it. The inside was dim, lit only by the fading light through the window, but it was enough to see the shape of the space, the bare table, the chair, the floor that needed care but did not feel broken. Maggie stepped inside slowly, her gaze moving across the room, taking it in not as it was, but as it could become. She turned slightly, looking back toward the doorway where Ethan now stood, not crossing the threshold, not entering uninvited, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was no longer uncertain. It was something else now, something built from the choices already made. "It stands," she said quietly, echoing his earlier words, and there was a faint trace of something in her voice that had not been there before, not doubt, not hesitation, something closer to acceptance. Ethan gave a small nod, acknowledging that without adding to it, and remained where he was, still leaving the space hers to define. Maggie turned back into the room, taking another step forward, her boots soft against the wooden floor, and as she moved further inside, the last light of the day slipped away behind her, leaving the house in quiet shadow, not empty, not lonely, but waiting, and for the first time, Maggie did not feel like she was stepping into something unknown. She felt like she was stepping into something that had been waiting for her to arrive. The quiet inside the house settled around Maggie Hale like a breath that had been waiting to be taken, deep and unbroken. And for a moment she simply stood there, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness, letting her senses catch up with where she was, because nothing in her life before this had prepared her for a space that did not already carry someone else's expectations. The floor creaked softly under her weight as she took another step forward, testing it not out of doubt, but out of awareness, noticing how even the smallest sound belonged to her now, not to a crowd, not to a judgment, just to her presence. Outside, Ethan Cole remained at the doorway, his silhouette framed against the fading light, not entering, not speaking, allowing the moment to remain hers in its entirety, and Maggie felt that choice as clearly as if he had said it out loud. She moved toward the table in the center of the room, her fingers brushing lightly across its surface, tracing the grain of the wood, the small imperfections that spoke of use and time rather than neglect, and she realized that nothing here needed to be perfect to be real. A faint breeze slipped through the open doorway behind her, stirring the edge of a curtain near the window, and the movement caught her attention, drawing her gaze outward for a brief second, toward the land stretching beyond the house, open and unclaimed by anyone's opinion. She turned back slowly, taking in the space again, this time not as something unfamiliar, but as something beginning to take shape in her mind, a place where her presence would not be questioned, where her voice would not be measured against someone else's idea of what it should sound like. Ethan shifted slightly at the doorway, not stepping inside, but adjusting his stance as the last light faded, and after a moment, he spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying only as far as it needed to. "There is water about 50 yards behind the house, and the fence line runs another 100 yards out past the east side." He paused there, not continuing, not offering more than what was necessary, because he understood that this was not about explaining the place, it was about allowing her to discover it. Maggie listened, absorbing the details, not as instructions, but as possibilities, and she gave a small nod, acknowledging his words without turning them into something larger than they were. The room grew darker now, the outlines softening as the last traces of daylight slipped away, and Maggie moved toward the window, placing her hand lightly against the frame as she looked out, her reflection faintly visible against the glass, not obscured, not diminished, just present. For years, she had avoided her own reflection, not out of fear, but out of habit, because it had always been easier to see herself through the way others looked at her. But now, standing here in the quiet, she saw something different, not a change in who she was, but a change in how she allowed herself to be seen. She turned back toward the doorway, where Ethan still stood, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer uncertain, no longer waiting to be filled, but steady, grounded in everything that had already been chosen. "You are not coming in," she said finally, her tone calm, not questioning, simply observing. Ethan gave a small shake of his head, a quiet answer that carried no hesitation. "Not unless you ask." The words settled into the room, simple and clear, and Maggie felt something shift again, not in the space around her, but within herself, a recognition of what it meant to be given not just a place, but a choice. She looked at him for a long moment, weighing not his presence, but her own readiness, and then she stepped back from the window, her hand lowering to her side as she faced the room once more. The house stood quiet, unchanged, waiting, and Maggie understood that what came next would not be decided by what the house was, or what the town had been, but by what she chose to build within these walls, one decision at a time, beginning with the one she had not yet spoken. The house held its quiet, steady and patient, as if it had all the time in the world to wait for whatever Maggie Hale would decide next, and she stood there in the center of it, feeling that silence not as emptiness, but as space, something wide enough to hold a choice without rushing it. Outside, the last trace of daylight faded completely, leaving only the soft blue of evening settling over the land, and Ethan Cole remained at the doorway, his figure now more shadow than form, still present, still waiting, but never stepping forward without being asked. Maggie let her gaze move slowly across the room once more. The table, the chair, the bare floor, each detail simple, unfinished, and yet full of possibility, and she realized that for the first time, nothing here was telling her who she needed to be. The decision was hers, entirely. She turned toward the door again, her steps unhurried, the sound of her boots against the wood quiet but certain, and when she reached the threshold, she stopped just short of it, standing close enough to see him clearly even in the dim light, close enough to feel the steady calm that seemed to follow him without effort. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The night air moved gently between them, carrying the faint scent of open land, cool and clean, and Maggie felt something settle inside her, not doubt, not hesitation, something clearer than that. Choice. She looked at him, not searching, not questioning, just seeing, and then she said, "Step inside." The words were simple, but they carried the full weight of everything that had come before, and for a brief second, Ethan did not move, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for what those words meant. Then he nodded once, small and steady, and crossed the threshold without sound. He did not step far, only enough to stand just inside the door, leaving the rest of the space open, unchanged, still hers to shape. Maggie watched that, the way he entered without taking, without filling the room, and something in her chest eased in a way she had not known was possible. She turned back into the house, moving a few steps farther in, and this time, she did not pause. The space no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt claimed. Ethan closed the door gently behind him, the soft click of it settling into the room like a quiet boundary between what had been and what would come next. The darkness inside deepened, but it did not feel uncertain. It felt calm. Maggie moved toward the table again, resting her hand against it as she looked around, her eyes adjusting fully now, and she spoke without turning, her voice steady, grounded. "This place, it does not need to be perfect." Ethan leaned lightly against the wall near the door, his posture relaxed, his presence there but never pressing into her space, and he answered simply, "No." That single word held no expectation, no condition, just agreement. Maggie nodded slightly, more to herself than to him, and in that moment, she understood something that had taken her years to reach, that she did not need to become something else to belong somewhere. She only needed a place where she was allowed to remain who she already was. The night settled fully outside, the land quiet beyond the walls, and inside, the house stood steady, no longer waiting, no longer empty, but holding two people who had chosen to stand within it on their own terms. And for the first time, Maggie Hale felt that what she was building here would not be shaped by the voices she had left behind, but by the quiet strength of the choices she was finally free to make. The night settled deeper around the house, wrapping it in a quiet that felt steady rather than empty, and Maggie Hale stood near the table, her hand still resting lightly against the wood, as if grounding herself in something real, something that would not shift beneath her without warning. The air inside carried the faint scent of aged timber and dust, but it did not feel neglected. It felt untouched, like a place that had been waiting for intention rather than repair. Ethan Cole remained near the wall, his presence calm, unobtrusive, and for a while neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence itself had become something they no longer feared. Outside, the wind moved softly across the open land, brushing against the sides of the house in a low, steady rhythm, and Maggie listened to it, recognizing that this sound, unlike the voices she had left behind, did not ask anything from her. It simply existed. She moved slowly across the room, her steps more certain now, no longer testing, no longer hesitant, and as she reached the far wall, she turned back, her eyes adjusting fully to the dimness, seeing the space not as it was, but as it could become. A chair pulled closer to the table, a lamp placed near the window. Small changes, real ones. Her life had never been built on grand moments. It had always been shaped by small, quiet decisions, the kind that no one noticed until they were already part of something larger. Ethan shifted slightly, not to interrupt, but to acknowledge that he was still there, still part of the space she was now shaping. And after a moment, Maggie spoke, her voice calm, measured, carrying a new kind of steadiness that had not been there before. Tomorrow, she said, not as a question, not as uncertainty, but as a beginning. Ethan nodded once, understanding without needing explanation. Tomorrow, he repeated, his tone matching hers, simple, grounded, without adding weight to what did not need it. Maggie took another slow breath, letting it settle deep, and for the first time, she allowed herself to think beyond the moment, beyond the house, beyond the road that had brought her here. Tomorrow meant work. It meant decisions. It meant building something that did not yet exist. But it also meant something else, something quieter, something more important. It meant she was no longer waiting for life to be decided for her. She turned her gaze toward the window again, the darkness outside reflecting faintly back at her, and she did not look away this time. She held it. The reflection did not change her. It did not diminish her. It simply showed her as she was. And that was enough. Ethan moved a few steps closer, not crossing into her space, but no longer distant either, adjusting to the shape of something new forming between them, something that did not need to be named yet to be real. The house held them both now, not as strangers, not as roles defined by others, but as two people who had stepped away from what had been expected of them and into something chosen instead. Maggie lowered her hand from the table and let it rest at her side, her posture relaxed but steady, and in that small, quiet motion, there was a shift that no one in Red Creek would have recognized, because it was not something that could be seen from the outside. It was something that had taken root within her. The night moved on, the land remained still, and inside the house, Maggie Hale understood that what had begun in the dust of a town that once laughed at her had not ended there. It had followed her here, not as a memory, not as something to escape, but as something she had transformed, something she now carried not as a burden, but as proof that she could stand, choose, and move forward without asking permission from anyone ever again. Morning came without ceremony, a pale stretch of light rising over the horizon and slipping quietly through the window, touching the edges of the room as if it had always known where to go. And Maggie Hale was already awake, standing near the doorway, watching the land beyond the house as it revealed itself inch by inch under the new day. The air felt different in the morning, cooler, clearer, carrying the faint promise of something that had not yet been shaped. And for a moment she simply stood there, not thinking, not questioning, just breathing it in. Behind her, Ethan Cole stepped out onto the porch, his movements unhurried, the same steady rhythm that had followed him since the day before, and he did not speak, did not interrupt the stillness, because he understood that this moment belonged to her as much as the one before it had. Maggie stepped outside, the wood of the porch firm beneath her boots, and looked out across the land, the fence line stretching out in uneven lines, the grass catching the early light, the sky wide and open in a way that made everything feel possible without saying so out loud. She rested her hand lightly against the porch rail, not gripping it, just letting it be there, and for the first time, there was no instinct to pull back, no need to make herself smaller against the world in front of her. Ethan came to stand beside her, not close enough to crowd, not far enough to feel distant, and together they looked out over the same horizon, two figures sharing the same space without needing to define it. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called, a simple sound carried by the morning air, and Maggie noticed it, really noticed it, not as background, not as something passing by, but as part of the world she was now standing within fully. She let out a slow breath, steady and even, and spoke without turning her head, her voice quiet but certain. I used to think I was waiting for something to change. Ethan glanced at her briefly, then back toward the land, his expression calm, listening without interrupting. Maggie continued, her tone not heavy, not burdened, but clear. But nothing was ever going to change until I did. The words settled into the morning like they had always belonged there, simple, true, without needing anything added to them. Ethan nodded once, not in agreement alone, but in recognition, as if he had understood that long before she had spoken it. They stood there for a while longer, the silence no longer empty, no longer uncertain, but full in a way that did not need to be explained. The house behind them stood quiet, no longer waiting, no longer untouched, but part of something that had begun the moment she chose to step inside and claim it. Maggie looked down at her hands for a brief second, the same hands she had once hidden, once kept still to avoid notice, and now they rested openly against the wood, steady, unafraid, exactly as they were meant to be. She lifted her gaze again, looking out at the road that led away from the town, now barely visible in the distance, and there was no pull to return, no need to look back. Whatever had been left behind had already done its part. Ethan shifted slightly, adjusting his stance as the sun climbed higher, and Maggie felt it, that quiet presence beside her, not as something she depended on, but as something that chose to remain, just as she had chosen to stay. And in that quiet morning, with nothing but open land ahead and a house behind her that no longer felt like an unknown, Maggie Hale understood something that no one in that town had ever seen clearly, that a life is not given by the voices that judge it, nor taken by the ones that laugh at it. It is built, piece by piece, by the moments when a person decides to stand, to speak, and to walk forward without asking if they are allowed. And out here, where the wind carried no names and the land held no expectations, that was enough.